Why do people call us gypsies? Where does this word come from? Are we really that different from those people around us? I'm going to look at those questions and others in this lecture about Romani history, ethnicity and identity. My name is Dr. Adrian Marsh, and this is the Barvalipe Masterclass. It is often said that those who do not know their own history are condemned to repeat it. The same is true of those who don't know the history of others. They are condemned to repeat the same mistakes they make about other people. One of the things that's most important to Romani historians is to be able to discover our own history, to extract it, to be able to understand it using documentation, using artifacts, using the same methodology that other historians use about their own peoples. It is crucial if we want to make sure of our place in the world and make sure that other communities come to understand us and, more importantly, that we come to understand ourselves. It's crucial that we are the ones who are writing, researching, delivering our own history through our own publications, through our own Romani Studies courses. In order to be able to do that, we need to be in control of our own history, and we need to understand it. History is ethnicity and identity, and those who have been able to establish their ethnicity and identity have done so on the basis of building national histories, of putting resources into research, into documentation, into archives. These are the kinds of things that are used to base claims of territory, claims of being, claims of ethnicity which are often in competition with other claims of ethnicity. In this case, to be able to prove your ethnicity, your identity, you rely upon notions of history, notions of research and authenticity that are built through the scholarly process. Romani people aren't often allowed access to the scholarly process. There is a lack of trained historians amongst Romani communities. The numbers are slowly growing, but nevertheless, they are many fewer than they should be. One of the key things that needs to happen is support for those young Romani historians. This lecture is one of those ways in which we hope to be able to share Romani history, both amongst the non-Romani people who are interested in us, and more importantly, for Romani people themselves. The ancestry of the Romani people goes back to India, not Egypt. The Romani language itself is an Indo-Aryan language from the Middle Indo-Aryan period. This means that the Romani language came out of India with its speakers sometime around 1000 AD. We know this because Indo-Aryan has distinct phases in its development. Old Indo-Aryan had three genders, masculine, feminine and neuter. Middle Indo-Aryan lost the neuter gender. Those people who speak modern Romanes speak a language that's based on Middle Indo-Aryan with a masculine and feminine gender. Those people who speak a language which does still retain the neuter gender are the Damari, who are present in the Middle East through Anatolia and much of Central Asia. The other linguistic community amongst Romani peoples are the Lomavren. These are the people who arrived in eastern Anatolia, in the Armenian lands, and whose language was much more influenced by Armenian than the Rom or the Dom. Their language retains patterns and syntax from medieval Armenian. In this case, it demonstrates a much clearer difference from modern Romanes and modern Damari. These three important linguistic communities all stem originally from India. The Damari are the first community to leave sometime around the 8th century CE. that is Common Era, with the first Muslim invasions of the region under the Umayyad Caliphate. The second group are the Rom. Their language, as I said earlier, goes back to Middle Indo-Aryan. This is the one that lost the neuter gender. We're talking about a language that developed around 1000 CE. The third linguistic community amongst the Romani peoples are the Lom, who speak Lom of Ren. The Lom of Ren are a group of people who broke away from the main migrations to establish themselves amongst the Armenian communities in the early medieval period, 1000 to 1500 CE. If we look at the terminology that is used here, Rom, Dom and Lom, we're looking to constructs that allow us to differentiate between these three linguistic communities. They are all based, however, on the notion that Rom, or Dom, or Lom, represents a word meaning man or individual. One of the reasons that this has come up for debate is because this terminology looks backwards to an Indian origin. However, as I will detail a bit later on, one of the key discussions is around the origins of the term Roma, and in that there may well be a claim that the term Roma does not come from India in its origins, but comes from 14th century Byzantium, and then specifically the Peloponnese. Now, if the ancestry of Romani people is in India, does that mean that the identity originates in India? The answer to that is no. We're talking about the ancestry of Romani people, and in that sense we're talking about what might constitute origins in the notion that the original people who make up modern Romani populations stem from an Indic population. And the story as to how they came to be in Europe after originating in north central and northwestern India is one that very few people know or understand. When it comes to the origins of Romani identity, however, that's a story that features from Byzantium, from what was the East Roman Empire after the fall of Rome in the 5th century. The East Roman Empire carried on, and in fact it carried on over 1,000 years after the fall of Western Rome, until the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in May 1453. The story of Romani identity is one that emerges from Byzantium between the 11th century and the 15th century. And as part of this lecture, I will take you through the evidence that we have that allows us to see the development of Romani language and Romani identity and how it emerges in the context of the high medieval period under the Byzantines. So let's look at the story of how Hindus ended up migrating westwards and arriving in Constantinople in the middle of the 11th century as Egyptians. The emergence of a highly organized and successful Islamic power state in the late 10th century took place under the control of the Ghaznavids. These were a group of Persianized Turks who set themselves up independent of the caliphate at the time and were able to conquer large parts of northwestern and north-central India. In a series of successive raids from 997 to 1030, the Amir, later Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, carried out a series of astonishing campaigns aimed at capturing huge amounts of slaves and of booty, gold, silver, and other precious metals and jewels. Mahmud was highly successful in his campaigns because he had one of the first standing armies, fully paid, constantly at his beck and call. His foes at this point were the Rajput kingdoms of India. Many of them were small, many of them independent of each other. Most of them had warriors, Rajput warriors, the Kshatriya class, who were the opposition to Mahmud's incursions. However, with much less well-organized forces, they were unable to withstand Mahmud's onslaught. He was highly successful in these campaigns also because he quickly adapted his tactics, taking on board the use of elephants, the use of artillery, i.e. bolts and catapults. He was able to defeat the Rajput armies through this combination of adaptability and successful organisation and having a permanent standing army. On one campaign into north-central India, he captured an entire city on the Ganges basin. With all of these Hindu slaves, he took them back to his capital in Ghazni, now Ghazni in Afghanistan. Mahmud of Ghazni was able to establish his capital at Ghazni using the slaves that he'd captured in India. His empire stretched from north-central India all the way through to Khorasan in northern Iran. It took in territories that stretched in the north from Merv in Transoxiana all the way down to the Iranian border. One of the noticeable things about Mahmud was that he incorporated the Hindus he captured into his own personal retinue. He established a cohort of 6,000 Ghulam, Hindu Ghulam. These were soldiers that were loyal to him and him alone, and he never allowed them to convert to Islam. What he wanted was a group of soldiers that would do his bidding, but who would forge no alliances with local power bases and alternative warlords. Thus, they needed to be separated through religion. The Hindu slave servitors, the Ghulam, were often used by Mahmud not just against his enemies who were non-Muslims. He used them frequently also to put down rebellions of Muslim subjects and Christians and Jews, the peoples who were protected by the book, the Dhimmi, as it is in Arabic. There is one occasion in Nishapur where the citizens of Nishapur write to him complaining about the fact that he has used heathens to oppress them. He has sent the Hindus in to quell their rioting over unfair taxes. This is one of the things that is most remarkable about the Ghaznavid state. Its incorporation of ethnic units of troops made it unique at the time, but it also provided a model for later successful Islamic empires. Mahmud died in 1030, leaving the empire to his son Masud. And unlike Mahmud, Masud was less careful in his diplomacy. Instead of courting the Seljuk Turks, a new, vibrant, emerging power in Central Asia, Masud decided to confront them. He fought a pitched battle with the Seljuk Turks at Dandan Khan, not far from Merv, in 1040. And the Seljuk Name, the record that was written later in the Seljuk Empire, tells us that Masud on his white elephant, surrounded by his Hindu Ghulams, fought to the last man standing, with the Ghulams tying the ends of their silk shirts together in order to stay united in the face of the Seljuk onslaught. In the defeat at the Battle of Dandan Khan in 1040, we see the survivors of that defeat, the Hindu slave servitors, fleeing westward ahead of the Seljuk advance. This is what we might describe as the start of the long road west, the migration of the Roma. One of the most important things to remember about medieval armies is the fact that they were societies on the move, unlike modern armies, which are just made up of soldiers and supports. In a medieval army, the soldiers made up basically 1/3 of the total. If you had 10,000 warriors, you had 20,000 auxiliaries, supporters, bakers, tent makers, armourers, blacksmiths, washerwomen, merchants and children. So when we talk about those who survived the Battle of Dandan Khan in 1040, we're talking about these people, not the warriors themselves. As I said earlier, the Seljuk Name tells us that the warriors stood to the last man. Now that may or may not be true, and it may be medieval hyperbole. However, the truth is that as a warrior group, these people were decimated by the Seljuk attack. Those who were left were the auxiliaries, the people who were the blacksmiths, the tent makers, the fletchers, the armourers. They were also the entertainers, the children, the women. These are the people who begin the long march west. These are the people who by 1050 have arrived in Constantinople and there been mistaken for Egyptians. We don't know the exact route of migration through Anatolia, but some of the sources that come from Armenian history, such as the Chronicle of Matthew of Edessa, tell us that at points there were groups of black tents camped outside the walls of Ani. Ani is now a ruined city in the northeast of Anatolia, but at this time it was the capital of the Bagratid Kingdom of Armenia. It was the bulwark of the east against the Seljuk Turks, those people who are described in the sources as Saracens. And Matthew describes at one point there were a group of black tents outside of the walls of Ani, peoples who he called a vagabond nation. So we have some indication that in the initial stages from Khorasan through to northeastern Anatolia, the ancestors of modern Romani people were stopping at Ani. Now it's likely that pursued by the Seljuks, who were mounting ever-increasing raids upon Armenian and Byzantine territory, they fled ahead of these troops and travelled through central Anatolia along what was the old royal road, which went back to the Persians but had been improved during the conquests of Alexander the Great. These roads were still used by the Byzantines, of course, to move their military might, to move their troops quickly from western Anatolia through to the east, which was the main point of conflict during the 11th century. So it's likely that the ancestors of Romani people themselves moved along the royal road and came through central Anatolia to arrive at the Asian coast of the Bosphorus. They arrived around what is now modern Kadikoy, and there it's likely that they were able to cross the Bosphorus to the old city of Constantinople, often called the city. Our first real record that we can rely upon comes from 1050 and from a life of St. George of Edirne. St. George the Athonite was head of a monastery upon the holy mountain of Athos. He was a Georgian saint, and his life was written up later, but records many events that are important in this period for Byzantine historians. The one that most concerns us as Romani historians is the one that tells us of arrival of a group of Egyptian magicians who were asked by Constantine IX Monomarchus, a term which means he who fights alone. They were asked by the emperor, the Basileus, to clear his favourite hunting grounds, which were just outside the walls of Constantinople, of wild beasts that were killing his game, the deers, and other animals that he liked to hunt with his nobles. The Egyptians agreed to this task and asked for payment in gold. The emperor promised that they would be. When they returned, having completed the job, they asked for payment, and this is where St. George steps in. He was present when the Egyptians returned, and he condemned them as practices of sorcery and magic, as people of the devil, as followers of Simon Magus, who is a character who appears in the Acts of Apostles. He condemns them for practicing their sorcery upon the animals in the hunting ground. He tells the emperor that he should not be doing business with these people. They were the devil's people. And he asks the emperor for demonstrable proof that these people are able to do what they claim. He does not believe them. The Egyptians respond by bringing in a sick dog, saying charms over it, upon which the dog dies. However, St. George challenges their power, and he makes the sign of the cross over them and sends a prayer to God, upon which the dog is revived. In the aftermath of this, the emperor ejects the Egyptians, unpaid I might add, and condemns them for their practice of sorcery in line with the advice of St. George. This incident is important because it establishes for us the period at which the ancestors of modern Romani people first appear in Constantinople. It also tells us from the very beginnings they had dealings with the nobility. In fact, they had dealings with the highest echelons in Byzantine society, the basileus, the emperor himself. And here we have what we can see as the beginnings of the notion that the ancestors of Romani people originate in India. Now, this confusion comes about because for the Byzantines, a deeply religious Orthodox people, anybody who practiced magic must come from Egypt. The Bible tells us so. When Moses takes up his issues with Pharaoh, it is Pharaoh's magicians who try and intimidate Moses through their performance of magic. Moses, of course, calls upon the powers of God to defeat them. So the Byzantines understood the practitioners of magic, dark-skinned, speaking another language, were in fact Egyptians and not from India. This is a mistake which perpetuates the idea that Egyptians, later Gypsies, are both magicians, practices of sorcery, and originally from Egypt. And it's one that's still widely held today. The other term that was frequently assigned again stems back to this particular incident. One of the terms that St. George condemns the Egyptians with is the term Atsinganoi. Now, the Atsinganoi were a heretic group in Byzantium in the 9th century. They practiced a mixture of Judaism, Christianity, stargazing, and Mazdaism from Persia. They were based in Phrygia, but largely exterminated by the Byzantine authorities at the end of the 9th century and beginning of the 10th. However, the memory of their heresy lived long in the Byzantine imagination, particularly amongst churchmen. And St. George accuses the Egyptians of being Atsinganoi, of being heretics, of being non-Orthodox Christians. Now, in these two terms that we use to describe the groups that we see at the court of Constantine Monomachus, we have the origins of the terms Tzigan and Gypsy. And linguistically, there is often this notion that ties the two together, and yet, in fact, that is a mistake. Tzigan derives from Atsinganoi, it means heretic. It does not mean Gypsy. Gypsy comes from the word Egyptian, and in the Byzantine Greek, that would be Aigupta. This is not a word that links itself intimately to notions of heretic or disbeliever. It is only later that it picks up connotations of thievery and unreliability. But it's important to make a clear distinction between these two terms. Medieval European societies pick up on these two terms to differing extents. Some societies emphasize Atsinganoi as the term they will use to describe the people arriving. Others accepted the definition of Egyptian or later Gypsy, possibly brought by the Romani people themselves, for reasons I will establish in a moment. It is these two terms that give rise to the modern terms Gypsy and Tzigan. And that lies in this original meeting in Constantinople in 1050. One of the ways in which the identity becomes embedded in Byzantium is because the term Egyptian allowed an economic opportunity for the ancestors of the Romani people. The notion that Egyptian magic was more authentic than other kinds of sorcery from Persia or Chaldea was extremely important. Its biblical connection allowed Byzantines to see the Romani people as authentic in their practice of divination. The occupations that we see described in Byzantine sources list fortune-telling, water divining, bear leading, interpreting clouds, making amulets as protection against the evil eye. So fortune-telling and sorcery is an important part of how the Egyptians, the Romani people, made their living in the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries in the Byzantine Empire. Later, at the end of the 12th century, we find documentation that tells us that there were also Egyptian acrobats. there is a very famous chronicle from the early 1300s by one of the most important figures in Byzantine society. In it, he describes a performance he witnesses. It is set up on the harbour side, in what is now modern Eminönü in Istanbul, and there he watches a group of acrobats do astonishing tricks, climbing upon each other, climbing up the masts of ships, tying ropes between the masts of ships, and then walking, tightrope walking between the two. When the performance is finished, he actually takes the opportunity to talk to these people and ask them where they are from. And they tell him a story about how they have originated in Egypt and how they have worked their way through the Arab lands, through Anatolia and into Constantinople, and how they are on their way through Europe into Spain, where they hope to be able to settle. Now, whether they did come from Egypt or whether they were making a claim similar to other Egyptians in the city, we don't know. But it may well be possible that they were Damari rather than Romani. However, their story also contains elements of tragedy. They tell the Byzantine that they started as a larger group, some 30-odd people, but because of the very dangerousness of their act, many of these people have fallen to their deaths or become horribly injured. He is extremely sympathetic towards this group and to their story. And one of the most important elements of his report is that he establishes clearly that the skills these people demonstrate are entirely due to their training, to their practice, to their expertise, and have nothing to do with magic whatsoever. It's clear from the sources that there are two views of the Egyptians in Byzantium. On one hand, they are seen as the practitioners of magic, of sorcery, of bear leading, of divination. On the other, there is the perception that these are skilled acrobats, tumblers, jugglers, people who are performers but do not use magic in their performance. And in here we have something of a dichotomy. Egyptians are seen as a complex series of figures. Some of those perceptions about them derive from the works of churchmen, of commentators, people like Theodore Balsamon, who describes the Egyptians in terms which condemn them for their practices and argue that anybody who consults them, who is an Orthodox churchgoer, should be excommunicated for a period of 5 to 7 years. On the other hand, we have the sympathy of Nicephorus Gregoras, who tells us this tragic tale of the acrobats who started out as 30 and by the time they get to Constantinople are very many fewer. Therein lies a more complex and nuanced picture than perhaps we are used to. And it's one that perhaps contains some elements of stereotyping, Egyptians as fortune tellers, Egyptians as performers, but on the other hand it may well describe the economic realities for Romani people in the capital of the Byzantine Empire between the middle of the 11th century and the beginnings of the 14th. I referred earlier to the question of where the term Rom originates. As I said, some scholars would argue that its origins lie in Hindi. Others have argued that the term comes from the Byzantine Empire. And if we look at the evidence historically, we find some justification for that. In 1384, an Italian nobleman, on his way to the Holy Land, on pilgrimage, with 12 of his companions, stopped off in what was then called Modon, in the Morea, what is now the Peloponnese. Outside the walls of Modon were a group of black tents. They seemed to be occupied by smiths and metalworkers. The Florentine nobleman was interested in where these people were from, but more importantly, he asked them a question which is one of the earliest points in time we can actually record a Romani voice. When he asked these people, "Who are you?" they gave him the answer, "We are the Romiti." or Romitoi. He said, "What do you mean by this?" And their response was, "We are the sons of the people who rule Rome." They were making a claim to the inheritance of the Roman Empire. Now, Byzantium wasn't called Byzantium by the people who lived in it. As far as those people were concerned, they lived in Rome, and the emperors were the emperors of Rome, of Rum. So the people who the nobleman asked were making a claim to be part of the empire, part of the imperium, the inheritors of Rome. As part of the imperium, the people living in black tents, the ancestors of modern Romani people, were claiming an inheritance of the Byzantine Empire. They were claiming to be the Romans. And in a sense, we are the last of the Romans as the modern Romani people. We are the inheritors of East Rome. We are the sons of the princes of Rome. This is one of the key moments in Romani history. This is an articulation of an ethnicity. This is a claim to identity, and one which relies upon association with a large, powerful polity, one which claims citizenship as part of an empire. It's also one that establishes the term Rom in a different context. It's not one that harks back to an Indian origin. It's one that is based firmly in that present, in the late 14th century, in Byzantium. And clearly those people understood themselves to be who they claimed to be. They were the Rom. Now, whether this is a case of just this small community living outside the walls of Modon, using this term amongst themselves, or whether this was a term that was used much more widely across the region of the Peloponnese, or, in fact, whether this was a term that was used across all the communities of the Byzantine Empire, we don't know. It's not a term that we find recorded anywhere else, apart from in this one document from late 14th century Italy. However, it is clearly an ethnic term. In order to understand that, one has to understand that the Romaioi, the Romans who lived in Byzantium, understood themselves to be an ethnic community of Romans. They didn't see themselves as Greeks. They didn't see themselves as Byzantines. That is a term that comes from German scholarship in the 19th century. As current Byzantinists have begun to see and to argue quite forcefully, Romaioi was not just a term that they used as a political designation. This was an ethnic designation about the community of Romans who lived in what was the Roman Empire. Now, those who lived in the black tents understood this, and they understood the implications of this. And when they claimed to be Romitoi, the small Romans, the little Romans, the sons of the Romans, they understood they were making an ethnic declaration. And in this, I think, we find the origins of the term Roma. And we also find in modern Romanes, particularly in Anglo-Romanes, the language of the English Gypsies, we find the term repeated. In Pogadichib, the language of the English Gypsies, the term we use to describe ourselves is Romani Chals, sons of the Romans. Amongst modern Romani populations in Turkey, the term there people use to describe themselves is Romanlar, the Romans. Now, clearly, people are making a call back. They are making a call to that original claim of ethnicity, identity, authority, belonging. And I think it's worth remembering that what we find in the late 14th century is the emergence, the beginnings of Romani identity in the Byzantine Empire. In a complementary way to the emergence of Romani identity in the late 14th century in Byzantium, we find also records of a language beginning to be recorded and spoken. One of the courtiers from Constantinople, a certain Manuel Mazaris, was exiled for his part in an attempted coup. He was sent to the Peloponnese, and there he was ordered to stay. He then wrote a satirical letter to a friend of his that was called A Letter from Hades, and in it he describes his conditions living amongst the populations in the Peloponnese. He describes a series of different nations that inhabited the region, and amongst those nations he describes the Egyptians, and he makes very particular reference to the Egyptians as barbarophonos, speaking an unintelligible non-Greek language. This is 1415. We know that Mazaris wrote between January and October of that year, and that his letter was received in Constantinople at the end of that year. Now, what this tells us is that in the Peloponnesus, in the early 15th century, a widespread use of what was an emergent Romanes was being practiced by Romani communities, by the Romitoi. Now, we have clear evidence then amongst the documentation that we have a parallel development, the emergence of an ethnic identity based upon claims of inheritance and authority with the larger empire. We also have a record of language, the emergence of a specific Egyptian tongue, a language which is used amongst that community and is unintelligible to anybody else. Hence the term barbarophonos, a Greek word meaning non-Greek speaking, and from which, of course, we get the term barbarian. Now, Mazaris wasn't an ethnologue, and in his descriptions of the communities that exist in the Peloponnese, there is a great deal of satire. However, this significant recording of this community of Egyptians with their language, which he did not understand, and those around them did not understand, tells us that this was a cohesive community practicing a series of traditions with a culture that was expressed through their own language and possibly with an identity that they themselves understood as Romitoi.